down the rental.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of affordable
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. It's yeah, really good. It's like invest more savings, living downstairs, big impact. Yeah. It's cool. Good thing around the big African.
Right. Right.
Yeah. It is really good.
So there's a little bit of fruit outside, and coffee obviously. Coffee in the thing. I think we're running a little bit late as people wind up off the trains and get their affirmation going. We did have there's 22 people other than the speakers saying they were here, so we'll wait a little bit longer, but then Toy and I will start properly. You'll notice there's some considerable lighting and cameras going on. Hey, and that's this is CDII's first event, so they wanted like shots of Toya and I waving our arms. So if you have problems with the back of your head and yourself being filmed, then please let us know. Sorry, and we'll go from there. But maybe we'll get off at 5 or something. Yeah. Okay. But please help yourself to
Morning tea, coffee,
tea, fruit, etc.
It's got it in early. Yeah, I mean, I've got some plans to do things like that.
Right. Okay. So you like having it through the UK system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like Texas not bold. American spelling.
really? Such a fine frame.
Prefect about 10 years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
Here's our comps like and like yeah.
Great.
Which is very standard comp size.
It's become more and more common. Yeah, that's fine.
Liam taught me about our guy.
It's something that goes standard in the same way.
Because you want your
intellectual property. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why like
I see.
Yeah.
I see, because it's French.
Oh, yeah. Cool. That's great.
Anyway, like they were stuff on like
Thank you.
it's qualified to get
Because
like an entire people not knowing like we're so calmed down that they had no idea.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
yes, that's big.
I don't think you get
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry to mention this.
no, that's basically like
Yeah, you like
They give you an amplify, which is 2 years, and then additional years, and but it's not.
It was, for example, my institution. Yes.
Alright,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, people use it as partnership, right? But
Yeah.
in order to do that, you actually want to move. Or just bluff it and see if it's a good bluff.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Yeah, the trick is to.
I mean, that's been my strategy since I arrived.
Yeah.
I think,
Did you want places to not be able to imagine?
yeah, and I, you know,
Yeah.
I know Jason's negotiated for like promotion and
Yeah.
got off my position now.
Yeah.
Some of that's also too, just like, you know.
And also it's specific to institutions, not just the hospitals.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of it, you know, basically pretty competition. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you took in like 40K a year, you get like the full. Right? It's like,
Well, they have to chip in. They have to chip in.
yeah, yeah, because it's so small.
Yeah. I would like to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in the social, like, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. Welcome to, you know, it's a choice, right? It's just a choice. Great. What is the hour? Students out teaching.
Yeah.
Get the courses that you want. So that's higher.
But you see the other one pull up.
That's where all the research is now.
Right.
So just the translation where there's issues.
Yeah, I feel like this digital culture is really actually pretty popular.
Yeah, no, that is, but it sounds, and it varies from place to place. Places which are really high.
It's psychedelic, but it would be okay.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, both those fields are kind of anti-communist. Like, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, to an extent.
We try to hire.
Yeah, I just mean like pragmatic. Okay. So same design, right? It's like shoving God
Yes.
Everyone have any last minutes for coffee, tea, snacks? I might get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Toya Chinque. I'm one of the leads of the Critical Digital Infrastructures and Interfaces group. And I would like to firstly start with paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people, people of the lands on which we meet and gather today. And I acknowledge them and their elders and those that are emerging. This research group, Critical Digital Infrastructures, led by myself and Luke Hinsbergen, has come together from our interest in all things data and digital. The research group has drawn together people from across the university and also through our networks for all interest in all things digital and transformative. We look at how the digital and data is impacting on our everyday lives from a range of perspectives. We look at the infrastructural systems and the networks that are global and the impacts that this has on our everyday life. we have a range of researchers that are researching, and we have HDR students that look at topics from strategic digital information operations, empathy and debiasing through generative AI, distributed doubles, the use of GANs for critically exploring synthetic ornithology, GIS for communicating science. What brings us together is the digital across science, technology, information systems, humanities, and the creative arts. Before we start today, I'd like to say thank you to Luke for his terrific organisation and ideas and planning. Luke, it's a great joy to work with you. Luke, I'd like to invite you up to introduce our speaker today.
Sure.
Max, because I think I've gone into your presentation. Sorry. Yeah, cool. Okay, page down.
Yeah.
There. Welcome is what Toya said. This is what we're working from, just so we're clear. So yes, this is Toya's big slide. Thank you, Toya. And I wanted to just come up to first talk about our agenda very, very quickly. That's on the board. Maxi Gas, who I'll introduce presently, will be giving the keynote, and we will do that right now. I'm having some thought, just because no one's had their fruit or tea yet, to actually move the tea before session one. But maybe we'll see how we go after the keynote, what we're feeling like, how the discussion goes, and then we can get the scones while they're still hot type thing. And then double up on the sessions after that and break. So I just wanted to share what our day looks like. And yeah, now I would love to introduce Maxi Gas. Maxi Gas comes to us in solidarity. If you have ever received an email from Maxi Gas or conversed with him, that is how he starts conversations, and it's wonderful. But other than being just a wonderful person, Maxi Gas is the co-principal investigator of the Critical Infrastructure Lab at University of Amsterdam, is where I think the lab is associated. They call it InfraLab. We call it CIL, and I've been corrected, it's InfraLab. He is, however, now an assistant professor of computational methods for media and culture studies at Utrecht University, and he invites you to go visit him at Utrecht because Utrecht is wonderful. He studies programmable infrastructures such as 5G telecommunication networks and generative protocols for the smart city. His ongoing interest in hacker cultures is documented in the recently co-authored monograph with MIT Press entitled Resistance to the Current Dialectics of Hacking. That was in 2022. His most recent work, and what we'll be exploring a little bit today, focuses on infrastructural ideologies developed at the intersection of media studies with science and technology studies. So we will give it up to Maxi Gas. You can see the STS is built into our. Okay, sorry, that was what the one thing I wanted to point out. Great. So Maxi Gas, thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to your keynote.
Thank you.
Here.
So we have about an hour. That's a lot of time. So I really hope we have some opportunity for discussion after the presentation. And I read through the abstracts for today. I don't know all the presenters, so I'm also looking forward to get to know your perspectives. And I found many crossovers and connections to what I prepared for today. So I will also ask questions to you after your own presentations that connect to the work of the Critical Infrastructure Lab. I named the presentation the Critique of Infrastructural Ideologies, multi-scholar approach, mainly to have the opportunity to talk to you not just about the theoretical framework, but also about what the Critical Infrastructure Lab researchers actually look at. and to present our findings and also our policy interventions. I guess the main point that I'd like to put across today is that there is a connection between theoretical frameworks, how we approach our topics, and the outcomes, the practical consequences of our research. And that is important because a lot of critical research, even in science and technology studies, where a political consciousness is kind of part of the ethos of the discipline, a lot of the research stops with what Luc Boltanski called the sociology of fatalism. So explaining to the subjugated people why they are subjugated. And such a sociology cannot really contribute effectively to liberation, to change the situation. So we are trying to propose an approach, but also enabled by this approach, a practice that connects research with work in policy, work with civil society and social movements. Yeah, so Luc already introduced me. I'm one of the three co-principal investigators of the Critical Infrastructure Lab. I will explain the setup a bit in a moment. I have been working at the University of Amsterdam, and this is where the Critical Infrastructure Lab started. And from next year, I'm moving to Utrecht University to be assistant professor there. And so we are extending the lab to another university next year, as we extended it from the media department to reach European studies, where when one of my colleagues that you can see here, Mr. Uber, was appointed assistant professor in European studies. So we are quickly expanding lab that started at the beginning of this year. The third person that you can see on the podium of the University of Amsterdam in this photo is Fieke Jansen. And together we are the three co-principal investigators of the lab. So how this works is that we are studying digital infrastructures through three different lenses: standards, environment, and geopolitics. I lead the standards track, Fieke Jansen leads the environment track, and Niels Hanover leads the geopolitics track. And of course, then we always have to add that whatever interesting happens inside the lab is through the combination of these different lenses, and our work is closely intertwined with each other. So, for instance, I will present some of Fieke's work today. I could also talk about the lab as an infrastructure in itself, but I will spare you all the greasy details of building an organization with open source software and with the horizontal structure. The one thing that I wanted to point out is that we are not just criticizing power structures, but we also intentionally set up the lab in this way that there are three co-principal investigators, none of whom are big professors at the university, in order to challenge the individuation of academic knowledge production, and to be able to work as a collective. One of the so the three goals of the lab is to produce, of course, a solid body of research around these three topics, and as I said, to produce actionable policy recommendations from that research. But the third goal of the lab is to build a community around these topics. And this is why we also have at the moment 5 research fellows, and we are also organizing 2 reading groups, one on environment and one on infrastructures, that you can also join through Zoom. They are an accountability structure that where we don't expect everybody who comes to the reading group to have read all the text, so you don't have to be afraid of it. But it is actually a very good way to keep reading and discussing these topics. And it is one of the ways in which this community around the lab comes together. So we do probably too much work in a lot of different areas, but in terms of the focus, I can shortly say that I am focusing on studying 5G networks. Niels Tenhuber focuses on studying national internet initiatives, and Fike Jansen is engaged with data centers. So within these 3 case studies, we also have this analytical grid, where we look at the phenomena on the scale of the live world, on the scale of the region, so in terms of urban conflicts or how the rural is constructed by digital infrastructures, and also on a geopolitical scale. And one of the undercurrents of my presentation today is that the social conflicts around infrastructures are produced at the intersection of these scales. The second principle that we try to bring to our work is to look at the 3 different steps in the innovation pipeline, so standardization, implementation, and deployment. That is because there are a lot of studies, for instance, in internet governance of how standardization leads to power structures. But actually, what we learned from, for instance, doing infrastructure walks with people on the street is that there are many different configurations that are possible based on the standards of communication protocols. So the actual impact in real life situations depends also on the standardization, also on the implementation, and also on the deployment of these technologies. And the last principle is that we approach topics first starting with the contestation of the infrastructures. And after we looked at how infrastructures are contested, we try to formulate a critical approach, and from this critical approach produce the concrete utopias on which the policy recommendations are based. This doesn't mean that we are simply amplifying the voices of people who resist infrastructures. In fact, most of the time we have critiques of people, even of the people who resist the infrastructures. And of course, this critique is also something that we try to bring to these movements as a productive intervention. So my presentation is basically in 2 parts. First, I will talk about the theoretical framework of infrastructural ideologies. And second, I will try to show how this theoretical framework is applied in our research and policy work. So why infrastructural ideologies? There was supposed to be a material turn in science and technology studies, also in the study of new media. I assume a lot of you have heard about this material turn, no? But then I also went to the Forest conference where I met Luke for the first time in person. And looking through the program, I found that still most of the titles of the presentations contain socio-technical imaginaries, or people study metaphors. In the reading group, we have many very interesting books, but also often focused on the discourses around technologies. One of the most interesting proposals in this area was Moscow's technological sublime that I chose to highlight here. But the problem is that this is still based on the thinking of not the material turn, but the previous turn that happened, let's say in the 1980s, 1990s, which was called the cultural turn, where the idea was that everything can be subsumed under the symbolic order, and with the theory of communication, we can explain all the different phenomena that we encountered. So one of the aims behind elaborating the theoretical framework of infrastructural ideologies is to bring back attention to materiality. And of course, this is not a very original idea. In fact, I'm also studying the long-term trajectory of science and technology studies as a discipline. And anybody who looks at that sees that, let's say, every 10 years, there has to be a new Protestant movement who says that we have to take the book and we have to read it ourselves because the Catholic Church have abstracted the original teaching, and we have lost this connection to the materiality. So this is just a continuation of a struggle that have been waged by a previous generation of researchers. So apart from questions of materiality that I will come back to, infrastructural ideologies also offers, of course, many concepts because we have the opportunity to draw on a long line of work, mostly by Marxian scholars and critics, activists, and politicians who worked on ideology criticism as a theory, mostly focusing on consciousness as a kind of, well, for instance, class consciousness as a kind of situated knowledge. So producing truth not from the point of view of, let's say, Comtean objectivity, but from the point of view of a particular group that we want to be in solidarity with. And of course, Lukács writes about the consciousness of the working class. So this was the basis at that time. So we get theories of reification, interpellation. Husserl studied how subjects are produced through ideology. And even at the moment of Husserl, for instance, he took the role of institutions, but also the concrete architectures that shape power relations. So there was, from the beginning in the theories of ideology, an attention to social practice, but also the physical constraints that are put, for instance, on bodies in order to produce particular subjects. Antonio Gramsci theorized cultural hegemony, and this is also something that we can learn a lot from. And the theories of ideologies met with the study of new media in the work of Alexander Galloway, that was also in dialogue with Wendy Chun in response to Galloway's book of the interface effect. So we can use these two different literature, infrastructure studies and criticism of ideology from Marxian scholars in order to produce not just a critical perspective, but the concrete utopias that can go beyond the critique, beyond the sociology of fatalism. I've put up this the cover of this book from I guess 1978, just to show that I believe this is more or less the moment where the elaboration of ideologies in the literature kind of stalled, and how far they got was to look at, for instance, the school, not just as an institution, or the prison, not just as an institution, but also a particular architectural space in the work, of course, Michel Foucault's panopticon example is the most famous of this line of work, as something that produces particular subjects in a partial way in order to serve particular interests. But apart from a few works like this one, the role of technology was never elaborated properly within the discussions around ideologies. So this is the thread, this is the moment where we can pick up the thread of this literature and make the connections with another long line of works which are on infrastructure. I will not present you infrastructure studies as a discipline because of the topic of the symposium. I assume that most of you are familiar with that line of work. So especially if we contrast infrastructural ideologies with approaching a topic as from the point of view of socio-technical material, socio-technical imaginaries alone, we can see that if we look at something as an infrastructural ideology, there are many more. There are a host of questions that come up that we can use in our research and which orient to us towards attention to the materiality of the medium. I'd like to pick out from this list the fact that, of course, media studies has always said that medium structures space and time in particular ways. So we talked about space and time compression in the work of Manuel Castells, who integrated this new media perspective into urban geography and then and the sociology of network societies, but also, for instance, in German media theory, in the work of Kittler, who talks about the microtemporalities of processors. And we could go on and on and on. The point is that if we bring together this idea that the medium structures space and time with the idea that ideologies work through creating a precise, strategically deployed architectural space, then we don't just have an opportunity to understand media, but also we are acquiring a position from which we can criticize power relationships. So this is also something that socio-technical imaginaries by themselves cannot do. Socio-technical imaginaries or even boundary objects are often used to explain why different actors can cooperate around a certain project or around the operation of a certain infrastructure. But socio-technical imaginaries are limited in explaining how this infrastructure works differently for different people. Someone has the microphone on, I guess, in the Zoom session. You handle it and shut them up. Good. So where was I? That if we look at something in terms of socio-technical imaginaries, we can understand how very different actors cooperate around it, but not necessarily how this infrastructure can shut some people out, like we just did, and how it amplifies the voices of other people, like the microphone here. I'm not trying to say that there are no critical studies that work with discourses, metaphors, or socio-technical imaginaries. In fact, there are plenty. And this is exactly what makes me sad when I see that the actual thrust, motivation, and results of these studies is not actually supported by the theoretical framework that they employ. So researchers have to spend a lot of time actually trying to fight against their own theoretical framework, doing a discourse analysis, and then trying to reach materiality through this. And this question has vast and complicated methodological aspects as well of why and how researchers chose the interview method as the most popular approach to topics nowadays. But I will not go there because I'm focusing now on the theoretical questions of this. So one of the findings or results of us as a critical infrastructure lab working with this framework of infrastructural ideologies and doing walks with people on the street in a framework that is called infrastructure walk, which is like bird watching, but with spectrometers, with wave detectors. We came up with these four principles that we can always apply when we look at an infrastructure. So the infrastructure should be noticeable, which means that people should be able to see. So that's very important because, for instance, in 5G networks, when the users are identified, there is no user interaction that is happening. So just the fact that we are part of an infrastructure is not apparent, is not necessarily something that happens through a user interface. There are many other interfaces that are at work in infrastructures, but it is not a given that we are even aware of the power relationships in which infrastructures place us. So then the infrastructure should also be observable. We should be able to find out how does it work. And of course, open standards and open standardization processes have a big role to play, especially when we come to talk about communication infrastructures. And the third one is that the infrastructure should be accountable. So we should be able to find out, even if we are just standing on the street and looking at an antenna, whose antenna is this? And which organization is operating it, who is taking responsibility for it. Last but not least, our most controversial proposal is that the infrastructure should be contestable. And this simply means that we should be able to say no to infrastructures. And for instance, in the deployment of 5G networks and in the context of urban policy, this is a very big demand that we can ask from policymakers and politicians. So these different principles orient us towards questions of finding out who can exercise what kind of power through infrastructures. Now, I was trying to convince you that this is the most suitable theoretical framework for critical studies that produce policy recommendations, but I didn't really tell you what is the theoretical framework of critical infrastructural ideologies. So I will try to do that now. This is a very complicated sentence. It's my thesis sentence, so I broke it down into different points, and I'm trying to explain why I think each of these points is important. So infrastructural ideologies allow us to study and critique the co-production of political subjects and technological sovereignty. So we have a lot of concepts here that has to do with power, and this is the way in which we can place not just the infrastructure, but its users in power relationships between them. This happens in the framework of second, flexible, liquid modernity. So I'm drawing on another strand of literature in sociology here, where the gist of the argument, for instance, from Ulrich Beck in Risk Societies, is that the first modernity dealt with the question of humanity trying to transform nature into a form that is useful for humanity, while the second modernity is about humanity trying to deal with the consequences of having transformed nature into a form that was thought at that time to be useful for humanity. Which means that in second modernity, we are not dealing with the question of nature per se. We are dealing with technology as grounding our mediated relationship to nature, but also we are dealing with the technologies that we already installed that became the infrastructures of our lives. So when we ask the question of infrastructure, the question of technology, we are not just asking that because we are interested in this and not ice cream or donuts, but we are asking it because this is the question of our times, how we mediate our relationship to the world through infrastructures. I also find it important to mention media and control infrastructures together, because also what we see in 5G networks is that these are not simply communication networks as they were before. So when the telegraph was just about connecting two persons, and there was little automation in the middle, a lot of what 5G networks do is to connect machines to each other. So for instance, the management of a prison, opening and closing the doors at particular times, is not something that we have in mind when we say communication infrastructure. And I think that's also a paradigmatic change in the kind of objects that media studies have been looking at for decades, that these objects are more and more about machinic communication, which doesn't mean that we should forget about the production of political subjects and technological sovereignty. It just means that if we say media and control infrastructures, we can keep in mind that a lot of this infrastructure is actually connecting machines instead of connecting people. I already explained why I think the structuration of space and time is an important component of how power is exercised through infrastructures. So I will just say that the distribution of power is something that is also very easy to see if we approach a topic through infrastructural ideologies theoretical framework, because there is always the assumption that in an ideology there is something that users experience, there is something that as an imaginary is constructed around the technology, but this doesn't grasp the actual political consequences of that infrastructure. So actually I can show it on this slide. So infrastructures, of course, what we know from infrastructure studies, always work in a dialectic between visibility and invisibility. And the theory of ideology gives us a way to conceptualize this front story and backstory behind the infrastructures, and allows us to ask whether the socio-technical imaginaries correspond to the material configurations of the medium. What is the interaction there? So while socio-technical imaginaries is not a bad concept, it allows to do certain things, but what we can do more with infrastructural ideologies is to explain how these socio-technical imaginaries are strategically deployed by particular actors to serve partial interests. So I will just pick out two different strands of two different case studies that we are working on. This is 5G networks and data centers. And I will talk a bit more about 5G networks because this is where I am mainly involved. So we have a very simple approach to studying new technical objects. In order to study them, first we have to build them because we are interested in the material configurations. So we have to be get acquainted with the technology. So one of my projects is to build an experimental network setup that allows the parallel operation of 5G networks. I have been working on this since a number of years with Niels and Uwe. And you can see Niels and me here in the next iteration of our experiment with 5G networks, which was the People's 5G Laboratory, where we were not just building this network, but also organizing these infrastructure walks, pointing out the different antennas to people, and hopefully teaching people what is the difference between a 5G antenna and a 4G antenna, so that people who burn antennas can at least burn the proper antenna that they wanted. This work allowed us, who usually studied standardization processes, or I studied hacker communities, hacker scenes for 20 years. So it allowed us to really engage with the everyday consequences of these networks and also how they pertain to particular publics. The result of that of this cycle was an interactive robotic sculpture that we call Krabby, that we created in collaboration with research with an artist collective in Berlin and a critical engineering working group. And this sculpture rotates around, tries to find people in the vicinity, and then focus all the antennas on that person. And we spent a lot of time trying to translate our research, and we had to pick some focus. So we concentrated on this question of beam forming. That is one of the new techniques that is introduced in 5G networks, which is about directing the waves to a particular point. And there are many different consequences of this. But for instance, one is that the network knows with decimeter precision where the mobile phone is that the network is, that the antenna is serving. And of course, this has implications for privacy that we think are much more important than what conspiracy theories focus on. We're also interested in antennas, but they are interested in the new frequencies and the health effects of the new frequencies. And this is what worries them. So it was also a way to engage with the conspiracy theory communities that we also studied in terms of their representation on social media and in terms of who is burning 5G mass for what reasons. We placed the sculpture in the main public library in Amsterdam. So it is just next to the central station. and this allowed us to record 75 interviews with members of the general public, or more precisely, library goers in the inner city. And this was another way to learn what people want from infrastructures, but also to critically reflect on what we think is the public interest to advance in this telecommunication space. So how 5G networks are contested? I already mentioned that the main popular criticism of skeptics towards 5G networks is about the electromagnetic field and the electromagnetic radiation that comes from communication networks. This goes back to a long tradition that started with the electricity cables, actually. But then conspiracy theorists have seized on this and produced what we think is the only really effective and complete socio-technical imaginary around 5G networks during the pandemic, and spread this misinformation. At the same time, activists from these and also other more conventional social movements have been burning mobile phone masts, and this problem has been discussed on the level of the European Union, but also on the level of the industrial consortia of telecommunications companies. In the meantime, surprisingly, governments who have invested a lot in arguing that 5G networks are the future that will bring us modernity have also started to criticize 5G networks and contest them as infrastructure. So they placed economic sanctions on Huawei, first with this idea that Huawei networks that are made in China contain backdoors and are not safe and an issue of national security. But nobody could, this is exactly the same kind of national security as what brought us the weapons of mass destruction that still we haven't seen, but which justified the invasion of Iraq. So we actually studied the standardization of 5G, and what Nias and the colleague found is that it is in fact the Western secret services that are requesting the features that can be considered backdoor in the 5G standards, and Chinese vendors are very happy to implement whichever the Western powers want in order to ensure the compatibility of these networks with each other. So this is how 5G networks have been contested, and why. So we started with this notion, and we tried to reconstruct this idea of smartness as a force that acts in the world, and we concluded that what we are actually seeing in the case of 5G networks is the breakdown of the infrastructural ideology of smartness. So neither the Chinese state that uses 5G networks as a kind of bid for geopolitical hegemony, nor the companies that stake their financial future on the innovations around 5G networks were able to articulate strategically a complete and functional socio-technical imaginary around these networks. So the fact that the Western countries, the core economies of the West, have put sanctions on Huawei is actually a sign that the socio-technical imaginary have broken down. It didn't work as intended. And in this moment, we can always make the contrast with the early internet, where all kinds of power differences were theorized with the framework of the digital divide, and there were virtually no country that contested the deployment of internet infrastructure, because there was this idea, this socio-technical imaginary of the information superhighway, that actually justified why the internet is good for everybody. In the same way that the highway building gets state subsidies, and it is resulting in a highway that everybody can use, and that becomes important for individuals and corporations at the same time. This metaphor actually underpinned what the internet did. But if we look at it as an ideology, we can also observe, and by now there are many very good studies that have been carried out that show that the internet actually also functioned as a kind of network of tentacles for Silicon Valley capital to complete globalization in a different way, and to actually suck profits from markets that were inaccessible, even from social situations that were inaccessible before. So this internet imaginary has run out of steam by now. And as I said, the only people who could actually produce an imaginary were the conspiracy theorists, who could connect this technology to known personalities like Bill Gates, to actual historical events that people experienced in their everyday life, like the pandemic, and to absolute political values like civic freedoms. So, for instance, they were saying that Bill Gates, as either an alien or a Jew, is investing in vaccines since a lot of years now. And the latest idea is to install chips in people with the vaccinations, but also to use the lockdowns to install the 5G towers, and that would be the antennas to connect with these chips, and then mind control could be exercised through this new infrastructure. Of course, this sounds very implausible, but we cannot deny that there is a complete imaginary where conspiracy theories did what they are best in. They connected the dots. What is more surprising is that neither the Chinese state nor the telecommunications corporations, as a representative of capital in this story, have been able to pull off the same feat. So citizens live in infrastructural doubt about who does a 5G network serve, but also governments live in paranoia whether 5G networks are actually safe, and whether their technological sovereignty is in peril if they deploy these networks. Which means that actually there is a historical window of opportunity for intervention for media studies, because finally media studies can actually do the only thing that media studies is good for, which is that take a technical object and say, what is the meaning and purpose of this technical object in terms of its cultural, political, social, and so on implications. So in order to do this work and intervene in these situations, we advance this experimental network, the People's 5G Laboratory, where we actually can show that 5G networks can have interesting implications that are, for instance, supporting privacy instead of becoming a better surveillance infrastructure. But we could also contest spectrum auctions, where parts of the spectrum, the right to resonate the air in a certain rhythm, is auctioned away to commercial actors. We could say that when there is a spectrum auction happening, in the same way that radio frequencies for music and audio radio, the old school radio, are so when there are auctions for radio frequencies, the traditional radio frequencies, some of the spectrum is always assigned to community use. This is why community radios can work, that I learned are an important force in Melbourne, Mark told me. So we could create space for civil society involvement in 5G deployment by providing spectrum for it. Of course, at the same time, one of the problems is that the 5G standardization is happening in a commercial space in an industrial consortium that is called 3GPP, and we have to open the standardization process for public debates, but also for civil society participation. One of the examples that we use for this is exactly the conspiracy theories about the radiation in the electromagnetic spectrum, because the new frequencies have had to be contested on the street by social movements, because at the moment where it was not about the deployment of these technologies, it was about just the standardization of these technologies. There was no public input. Nobody asked any concerned citizens if they have a problem with this. So there was also no opportunity for negotiation. So the only place, the only means of public participation in the standardization, implementation, and deployment of 5G networks have been either to torch them or to start lawsuits and contest the deployment, which is a very end-of-pipe solution. So instead of proliferating this ideology of smartness, we propose to treat the spectrum as a critical natural resource and the networks themselves as a public good, as a utility. And with this, we can turn around the ideology of smartness that is, as I argue anyways, breaking down, and propose a different way of seeing these networks. So if we look at the contestation of data centers, we see that they are also contested by social movements. Data centers need a lot of natural resources, not just energy and water, but also conflict minerals that go into the hardware that is housed in the data center. So extractive industries are contested by local activists where the mining of these resources happen, but also what we see more visibly in the Netherlands is that there have been 3 different projects to build a hyperscale data center, and especially in the last one, it became a national issue, and it actually decided the local elections that activists, local politicians, and the farmers that were growing vegetables in greenhouses in that area have contested the construction of the data center. So some of these, some components of this politics we call not in the backyard approach. And I highlighted this very component because actually what happened is that the data center will not be built in the Netherlands now, it will be built in Portugal. For the reason that in Portugal, there are less social movements and politicians and a weaker regulatory regime. So the data center can be built facing less opposition. And this harks back to the so-called waste heaven hypothesis and that the negative consequences of technological development, for instance, electronic waste, accumulates within the territory of the Earth in the places that have the weakest environmental regulations. Why is this important for this perspective of looking at problems at different scales? Is that it shows that the local resistance was an interesting way to contest the deployment of the data center, but it just shifted the problem to another territory. So in order to address this, what we are trying to do is to develop policies that first could be applied nationally, but then they could be scaled up to the European Union level, because these conflicts are, of course, coming up in different places in the European Union. And on this scale, it is that this problem could actually be addressed. So, as why the data centers are actually a problem, and what is the infrastructural ideology that underpins them? The infrastructural ideology is centered around this idea of optimization. And of course, if we look at the natural resource requirements of data centers, this is the optimization of the energy use or the natural resource requirements of the technology, where the ideology is actually serving partial interests and not completing what is written on the box and what is advertised, is that what is optimized is the particular components. So we really get better standards and better hardware, better software configurations that are more energy efficient. The problem is that the industry is still thinking in this framework of infinite growth, so that a more efficient component will be used in a way that the data center can deploy more of these components. Which means that even though the resource use optimizations are actually impressive, the total resource use of the data center industry keeps growing. And in fact, the whole point of the optimization is to allow the data center industry to keep growing. And of course, then we see a kind of greenwashing logic there, where it is not just about imaginaries. The companies can actually show materially how the resource use is less, even though the economy will use more resources when considered as a totality. So in order to contest this ideology, PKI proposed the constraints of or the ideas of limits and reduction. And we arrived with this idea of treating data as a kind of waste and taking a waste management approach, where the first idea would be to consider what happens if we delete half of the data in data centers, which is, so this would be an underpinning of the data center policy, to categorize data centers and data itself according to which is actually the critical, what is actually the critical infrastructure there, and what is actually the critical data, and what is the data that we don't need, and what are the data centers that, for instance, doesn't need to be always on. And you can see here our principles coming back. So this would mean that it would be easier to contest data centers, because there would be different kind of data centers, and it wouldn't happen that as during the pandemic, the data centers were by default considered critical infrastructure, even if they were just hosting pictures of cats. So if we would have a clear distinction, this would allow us to make choices in this area. PIC also works outside of the critical infrastructure lab in the Green Screen Coalition, which is a coalition of funders, and here the critical infrastructure lab is also a member. And what they are doing is giving sub-granting, giving out grants in the Catalyst Fund to initiatives that would counter the infrastructural ideology of optimization and explore these possibilities of limits and reduction and treating data as waste. So I started with this question, why infrastructural ideologies? So I just want to say that what this theoretical framework allowed us to do is to look at the materiality of the medium in addition to the symbolic order that surrounds it, but also to produce what Friedrich Jameson calls cognitive maps of how infrastructures serve partial interests and how they are, of course, legitimized by making universal claims, and then to develop concrete utopias that are not speculative in the today's fashion, but are based on thinking and experimenting on the level of the material, engaging with these infrastructures on the level of the street, and then starting from contestation, we go through this analysis and arrive to the policy recommendations in collaboration with actors that we think are contesting the infrastructures. So that's all. I don't have a big conclusion. I just want to put this one sentence here, that the contestations of infrastructural power should traverse spatial dimensions. And why I think I already managed to explain how this works with the data centers, that contesting a data center locally will just shift the problem to another place. So we have to see what is the appropriate level and how, on what level it is worse and effective to contest an infrastructure, and how the transformation of the infrastructure would happen on another level. I also mentioned that in the case of 5G networks, the problem with allocating new frequencies was already controversial for some social groups, but these social groups were not allowed to the table when it was about the global process of industrial standardization. They could only take part in this process when the deployment happened on the regional level, thereby creating urban conflicts. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Lots of time for questions or comments. So yeah, I should just keep it pretty organic. And then
The last question is the one from the.
I'm so pleased I'm here. I'm all new to this field, or your lens on this field, so this is fantastic. Thank you. I'd like to, Maximus, to expand a bit more. When you say strategically deployed imaginaries, how planned is that? How strategic is that, or is it just anchored into a very human fright?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, there is a ruling class studies that is a special discipline to answer your question. But I think what is important, and that is a question that we get a lot about infrastructural ideologies, is that it makes it seem like there is really a plan. But actually, things are not like that. Things are complex and emergent, and there are local actors whose actions have unintended consequences on other levels, and so on and so forth. This is true. There is not a big plan. So how it is an empirical question, to what extent, for instance, capital can organize itself as a class and to what extent capital can actually advance its interests in an organized manner. And this is different in different historical moments. But when we say ideology, that doesn't mean that people come together and make a conspiracy theory between themselves. It means that there are certain kinds of people connected in cultural circuits that manage to produce their own culture that actually coordinates action to a certain extent. And I think that's really important also in the kind of literature of theories of ideology, that it really started with this idea that ideology is a misunderstanding that is in people's heads, or an evil plan that is in people's heads. And quite quickly, theorists of ideology arrived to this conclusion that ideology is actually something that is cultural, which means that it is an interpersonal, ontologically, it is an interpersonal entity. It is not tied to the individuality of particular persons. And of course, then the latest development where we are trying to connect ideology with infrastructure is that it is not just cultural in an undefined sense, but it's also very much tied to social practices, but also material configurations. So how the technology is designed can constrain and enable certain actions. And this is part of the ideological way of working of this technology. It can hide certain aspects of its operation and foreground others, for instance.
Thank you so much for your keynote on this important work, and it's really quite inspirational. I was just wondering, in terms of an intervention, could you talk through the capacity to do a data center walkthrough? Was that impromptu or was it organised?
Impromptu?
So for example, as an intervention, was there something that was done where people would turn up and try to gain access, maybe by force as an intervention, or was it organised so getting permissions, for example, meeting and greeting, getting an understanding of how the data centre works to share that information?
Yeah, so I have to credit student who just graduated and won an award for the thesis work, Yang Kong, who came with us on the first infrastructure walk and became inspired to do a data center walk. And it was she that explored this idea. And the first data center walk was actually not about entering a data center, but to see the connection between the data center and the landscape. So how the data center fits into the landscape. And when she organized the second data center walk, she was already well acquainted with the data centers in the science park, that is the territory of area of Amsterdam with the most data centers. And she found a data center that is actually a very key component of communication networks, digital networks in the Netherlands, and it is connected to the university. And it is operated on a kind of non-profit basis. And we found really amazing people there that started to engage with us on multiple different student-led projects. So now another student project is looking at the sensory ethnography of the data center. And Camila Palermo managed to record hours and hours of video and sound, temperature and other measurements in the data center based on this collaboration. So that's the story behind the data center work. But yeah, I mean, in general, as a kind of methodological principle, I have to say that loitering and visual observation goes a long way. So if you're interested in something, you have to hang out and you have to look at it a lot. And usually that produces some kind of result. And yeah, we were also amazed at how much we could gain just by trying to be close to these infrastructure.
Early in the talk you paired, which was great by the way, you paired political subjectivity and political subjects with technological sovereignty. And I was wondering what you meant by technological sovereignty.
Great, thank you for asking this question. Yeah, so when ideologies theorize subject production, that's always, at least for me, that's always a question of if subjects are produced, of what they are the subjects of. And so technological sovereignty in the larger framework serves this purpose, that the infrastructure interpellates users to become subjects of the infrastructure, in which they become part of this, let's say, technology infrastructure or regime, and then they are subjects under a technological sovereignty, because sovereignty is this power that is usually associated with the state. But for instance, Benjamin Bratton says that corporations can also have a form of sovereignty. But certainly it is about control over a specific territory. And we will see today how territories are complicated by digital networks. But definitely an infrastructure calls forth a certain territory that is inhabited by certain subjects, and the powers that are configured by this infrastructure we call technological sovereignty.
I think that's just a really interesting point, because I mean, as per the title of common sovereigns, I mean maybe there's dual move there, in that, you know, there's some commonality between the subjects as well, right? In terms of that territoriality, and then between that commonality, you know, there's room, or I guess an envelope, to make things noticeable, observable, accountable, and then you can contest because you've identified, you know, in a way that's sovereign, right? And that was kind of like the common sovereign that we're, you know, subjects of. But anyways, I have a couple questions for anyone.
You can also say that sort of sovereign as a default concept. About the fact that for Indigenous people, sovereignty is not sort of manufactured, it's sort of always already there in some respects, in terms of that territory, but also deterritorialization.
We studied identity regimes, so let's say solutions for digital identity, and there was also this result from that research that there could be a lot of different contesting actors around the topic of digital identity are trying to come up with the perfect algorithm, the correct technical solution to this problem. But then the question is not whether the technical solution is perfect. The question is who is actually in a position to make that identity solution hegemonic in the infrastructural space. And there are many civil society strategies that are focused too much on the material configuration, but they don't take into account this question of technological sovereignty. So that, for instance, self-sovereign identities are interesting but they are as strong as the sovereignty behind them. And if this sovereignty is the sovereignty of the individual, that doesn't make a really useful identity if it is just grounded in an individual's power.
I mean, just picking up on that, do you think that's maybe something around, you know, that I really appreciate that disconnect between there's something enticing about the information superhighway, right? There's like this kind of like, from the like logical, rational, active point of view, something palpable, right? From the materiality of like opening your home to the rest of the world's information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? But when we think about like the 5G imaginary of like the hyper connected everything, I guess, like the human with, you know, it's extensions everywhere. There seems to be a lack of that kind of like impelling argument, and I'm just, you know, I'm wondering, is that part of it, or how do you see that kind of lack of narrative?
So in fact, following doing industry analysis on how 5G networks actually deployed 5G networks evolve, it is true that the most growing 5G market is what is called private 5G networks, which is not private 5G networks, it's corporate 5G networks. And that is because, indeed, this idea appeals, but not to people, but to companies. So it's a business-to-business value proposition. And indeed, that could make sense in economic terms, and it has some kind of science fiction flavor behind it. But as from what we see, this is not an effective one. This is not a complete story. There is no face of 5G. There is no historical moment of 5G.
Just have a follow-up question in terms of the connection between data center and what you call the landscape. I was wondering how you conceptualize the connection between data center and a so-called landscape that I see really creates on the source, and also you know, the nature as well. So it's about destruction, or it's about coexistence, or it's not long-term connection.
So we didn't go down this research trajectory, so I don't have a very good and complete answer for you. I can say the little pokes that we had at this problem. So Yang Kong, who started the data center work, she actually wanted to look at historical satellite images that show landscapes before and after data centers have been built, and the kind of evolution that followed. From the theoretical framework, of course, then the question is, how does the data center structure space and time? And we can see that, for instance, when the data center is shifted to Portugal, it is still a country where submarine cables arrive. It is still a country in the west of Europe, so there is some kind of territory there where it doesn't matter if it is in the Netherlands or Portugal, but maybe it is not good if it is in Switzerland, for instance. But then what personally I am more interested in is how the data center produces the rural, because that's also a big rural 5G is also a kind of thing. But my impression is that where 5G is producing an urban territory, and the data center is producing a rural territory. And of course, then there is an interdependency and that there is a metabolism that cuts through these two different territories. So that's as far as I got thinking. But do you speak about data centers today? There is someone that should present on data centers today, no?
I'll talk a little bit about this.
Adam, you will do that? Thank you. So you, I hope that will continue this line of elaboration.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more, sorry.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm just really interested in that last point, talking about how data centers produce the rural. Can you just expand on that?
Yes, but maybe in the break.
No problem.
All right, well, with that, excuse me. So on Max Gas's suggestion, let's do that. Let's maybe take just under 20 minutes for break. There hopefully is still treats and tea and coffee outside. We'll do that, and then we'll come through and do the first session and the second session back to back. If you are presenting the first session, please make sure that your slides, if you have them, are on that black ThinkPad. My run sheet says Zoe Isabel Luke. Yeah, and then after that, scroll. We have Jenna, Michael, and Bonnie. But we will run through all of those. If you can get your slides up onto the thing in the next 20 minutes, that'd be great.
Is there a reason we're not using the microphone? I feel it would be slightly easier without the speakers having to do the voice.
Sure.
Unless it's an issue with the,
I don't think it is. And there is no Zoom for the rest of the day, so we'll use it. Yeah.
Actually, just to close this part of the conference and maybe open a question for the future, with the invasion of so with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict coming up, we realized that maybe our theoretical framework of infrastructural ideologies is also breaking down, and because what we see there, and to an extent in Ukraine, is that when ideology breaks down, the other option is coercion. So maybe there is a need for a theory of infrastructures of coercion, not just infrastructures of ideology. But this is what Gramsci said, that there are two different ways of exercising power. And one is through getting the consent of the rule through ideology. And that is, of course, then the negative part of that is that if that doesn't work, then people come with a stick to.
I have heard of as effective